Well, it's about time for us to begin this morning. If you would be turning in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 24. We're going to be finishing the book of Matthew this morning, looking at Matthew chapters 24 through 28. Hopefully you all got the questions a few days ago from Kyle. And we're going to be talking about quite a few things this morning. This is, in a sense, a little bit shorter reading than some of the past readings have been, but there's quite a bit covered, right? It's the majority of the end of Jesus' life, the last few days of his life. He talks quite a bit about, and even chapter 24 and 25 for that matter are pretty dense as far as talking about what's often referred to as eschatology or a study of the end times or the end of the world, the end of time. So we'll be talking about some of those things this morning, but we'll be finishing the book of Matthew today, and then next week we're going to be starting in the book of Mark. And as we go forward in the Gospels, as I mentioned at the beginning of this quarter, this quarter we're going to be talking about three different Gospels, and so we're going to be covering all the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so we're going to see basically three different accounts of essentially the same thing, essentially the same story. And so as we go forward, I want to talk more about the harmony of the Gospels. So there are different charts and things. I'll try and send one of those out this week as far as what accounts, some parables or different things are found in different Gospels that aren't found in different Gospels. Obviously, next quarter, Ben will be teaching this class, and he'll be talking about the Gospel of John, which is quite different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So I think it'll be a really interesting segue and a really interesting rest of this class as far as talking about the different Gospels, and now that we've spent a substantial amount of time in Matthew, seeing what Mark and Luke look like. But let's go ahead and get started with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into the end of Matthew. Father, we're thankful to you for bringing us here this morning and giving us another day of life. Thank you for your revealed word and the lessons that it gives us about how we should be and who you are and how you operate. We're so thankful to be able to look at your Son and see how we should be and be in awe of his majesty and his authority and his humility. Despite who he was, we're in awe of the life that he lived and the form that he came in, choosing to be one of us for a time. And especially this morning, as we look at his death and his resurrection, we are in awe of what that means for us. And we thank you so much for him and his sacrifice and for your revealed word to show us what happened. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen. So as we've done in past weeks, we'll go ahead and look at the end of the outline that we've been working with. Again, I've mentioned in past classes, but if you would like, I've kind of condensed the outline as we've gone on, not just to not spend too much time just looking at the outline itself, but if you would like just like a Word document or a full, complete outline of what I've had on the screen, then by all means I can send that to you, so just let me know about that. Obviously we started with the arrival of Jesus, the baptism of Jesus, the ministry of John, and so it's just interesting. I think it's interesting to kind of look at, as we've gone throughout this class, again, in a way, we've spent quite a bit of time on the book of Matthew, but in a way, we're going through the book of Matthew very fast. I think it would be kind of an interesting comparison to compare this class to maybe what it would look like to spend a year in the book of Matthew or to spend a whole quarter just in the book of Matthew. So we've been able to see quite a bit so far, but we've also kind of glossed over some things that would be really interesting to talk about more at length. But just thinking about, as you kind of read through it somewhat faster, it's really fascinating to look at how far we've come, right? As far as starting with the birth of Jesus and just kind of reading through his 30-something years of life, it really in just a few weeks, and seeing all that happened. And we know that not even everything that happened, obviously, is recorded. And so it's just really the greatest story ever told, right? But there's just so much in there. So starting with his birth and John the Baptist, and then we get to the suffering of the Messiah revealed. Last week we talked about him when he started to reveal the fact that he was going to suffer and die and be raised, and we talked about obviously his disciples did not fully understand what that was going to look like. There's kind of that interesting dynamic that we've seen throughout this class of his disciples wanting to follow him and giving up everything to follow him, but still clearly having a lot of reservations or doubts or just a lack of clarity of who exactly he is, what exactly he's doing, what exactly he means by what he's saying. And then I know we sometimes like to give the apostles a hard time of, why did they abandon him, and why didn't they do more, or why didn't, we might have all these questions and maybe like to think that, I wouldn't have betrayed Jesus, or I wouldn't have denied Jesus, or I wouldn't have, and we can get into those conversations somewhat, but I do think, especially when you read through the way he talks, and sometimes it seems very abstract, but a lot of times it's very to the point. It's very direct, and Jesus says what he means, right? When he talks about judgment, he means it, and when he talks about God as his Father, he's being very serious about those things. And when he talks about the fact that he is going to be delivered into the hands of the Romans, and he's going to be crucified, he obviously means those things in a very literal sense. And so we can kind of sometimes maybe have this hindsight's always 20/20 kind of attitude about the disciples in the Gospels, but again, I think it's just really incredible to look back at what all they would have witnessed, and how would you react if you had been in their shoes. So getting into chapter 24, we have the Messiah's delay, return, and judgment, starting with, he talks about the birth pains, the tribulation, and the Son of Man, the nearness and time of Jesus' coming, parabolic exhortations to watch/prepare for his coming, and then some discussion of the final judgment in chapter 25. And we'll talk about those in just a moment. And then the crucified Messiah, probably the part of Matthew that maybe we read the most often, maybe tied with the Sermon on the Mount, but going through just everything that happened to him, the plot and his betrayal and establishing the Lord's Supper. I really liked, I've said this before, but just to be clear, this isn't my outline, but I really liked how letter C on the board there was phrased, Gethsemane, Jesus' agonizing prayers. Again, just thinking about the fact, he didn't sleep that night, and he just prayed and prepared for what was about to happen to him. And then his arrest and his trials, and then death, burial, resurrection. And that gets us almost to the end of the book. Well, and then we get the resurrection and the commission in chapter 28. So let's go ahead and get into question number 1, mainly in chapter 24, but also some of Matthew chapter 25. I kind of excluded the 2 parables that are in there. Feel free to reference the parables in your comments if those stood out to you, or if any details of those parables stood out to you. But the question was, what stands out to you about Jesus' extensive discussion of his return, judgment, and the last day in Matthew 24? How does his teaching here inform/change our daily walk as Christians? And then obviously there's that note from chapter 25 as well. I think it's interesting, again, putting ourselves in the shoes of the disciples. It's interesting to look at this through the disciples' eyes. Again, we know it's hard to act like you don't know things that you do know, right? We know that he's about to be crucified when he says this. We know that he's going to raise from the dead. We know that he ascended into heaven, and when he ascended into heaven, he said, I'm coming back someday the way I'm leaving. We know those things. But kind of trying to put yourself in the shoes of the disciples, if Jesus, the same Jesus who said, blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are the peacemakers, and talked about loving your neighbor as yourself, all the things that he's taught, and then for him, I think chapter 24 really stands out. But if you were an apostle, or if you were one of these people who had been following Jesus all this time, what would stand out to you from what Jesus says in Matthew 24 in comparison to what he said before? What stands out to you the most in this tone shift? Tim?
What stands out to me is how much detail he provides. He describes how the last day will occur, and what to expect, but the fact is you don't know when it's going to occur. Just a lot of information, which should have been very impressive to the disciples as it is to us today.
Right, exactly. It's almost as if he gives a whole nother, you almost want to call it a sermon, right, of just what exactly is going to happen. And obviously there's still a lot of things about that day that we don't know. The big thing is that we don't know when it's going to happen. And sometimes people kind of try and use that as maybe quote-unquote evidence against the Bible we've been in what some call the last days, or, we've been waiting for this near day or this day that's coming soon for 2,000 years now. But Tim's exactly right, just the amount of detail. And that goes back to something we've talked about in this class before about the authority that Jesus spoke with. Imagine having followed him, and then you know that he talks authoritatively. He has great command of the Mosaic law. He knows the law. He knows the scriptures. He knows what he's talking about. But just to talk in that much detail about something that would be so, again, abstract and far away, and just maybe something that really wasn't even talked about that much amongst Jewish people. So that's really fascinating to think about. What else stands out to you about what he says in chapter 24? Oh, yes, JD.
Well, for me, something that stands out is the symbolism of the faithful servant and the evil servant in my New King James. That's verses 45 to the end of the chapter. The faithful servant who is constantly on the watch for his master's return, while at the same time doing everything on the checklist, so to speak, that the master left behind for him until he returns, versus the servant who thinks that the master is running late or is delayed his coming and is taking basically the opportunity to basically do whatever he wants, only to have the consequences of those actions hit him like a chariot appropriate for the time.
Right, yes. You're exactly right. That sometimes we talk about how some people will point out how sometimes it almost seems like how are we as Christians not just constantly afraid of Jesus is coming back any minute, and we're going to be judged. Sometimes people almost talk in those, like, it's almost paranoid terms, but I think that symbolism of the servant is really helpful for, because when Jesus is using such intense, strong language of what all is going to happen, and there is going to be a judgment, and we don't know when he's coming back, and all of these things, it is terrifying, right? It is scary to think about the judgment. It is scary to think about the master coming back, and we don't know when that's going to happen. But I think that symbolism of a servant is really helpful, of just thinking that, we are just at work until our master comes back. And when he comes back is his prerogative. But we just keep working until he's told us what to do. So it's not like we're just, we kind of finished our checklist and then we're just waiting for him to get back. In a sense, it's irrelevant when he comes back, right? Because we should just be doing what we're supposed to be doing anyway, and just, patiently waiting for whenever that time may be. Tim?
So it's almost like a closing of like a movie or play or whatever. You've got the creation, the stars that fall from the sky, the sun. It talks about those things, and closing down. And then also those are constants that have always been there. Everybody's the sun will rise in the east and set in the west. Those are constants that we can always rely on. Well, not when this happens. That's it. And then the other thing is, people might think, okay, well, what about us? How does this affect us? If God just came to destroy the earth and that's it? No, he goes straight into how important we are to him. And he starts to talk about the elect in verse 31 and what he's going to do with us. And so we're not just here as, on the earth, naturalistically, like part of the earth. We're very important to him. And he went straight into that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think this, I think about when you think about parents, for example, right? Are we supposed to be scared of our parents? Or for those of you that are parents, do you want your children to be scared of you? No, right? Hopefully not. But to an appropriate amount, yes, right? Like, I think that thinking of God as our Father, right, is really helpful for kind of thinking about how we grapple with some of these things. Again, it can be very lofty and very, we're talking about eternity and we're talking about righteousness and judgment and these big ideas, but just thinking about we're not supposed to be shaking in our boots 24/7 because we don't know what's going to happen or we don't know when he's coming back. But Jesus puts a lot of emphasis on, my people are going to be spared. If you are a faithful servant, you will be rewarded for that. And so he talks about that quite extensively. So I wanted to mention briefly the destruction of Jerusalem. The destruction of Jerusalem, that we could get into all the history of what exactly happened in 70 AD. I know, and we could get into the false doctrine that exists that, kind of a lot of the end time prophecies that are in the New Testament took place in 70 AD. That's not what we're here to talk about this morning. But there, some people have kind of tried to point out different things in chapter 24, 25, and what is this exactly is this talking about? I do think the focus, though, when you look at the entirety of what Jesus talks about and what he's mentioning in these chapters and what all is going to happen, he's really talking about the end of time. He's talking about final judgment, the last day, as it's often referred to, and so. But again, he goes into great detail about what these birth pains are going to look like, what exactly this abomination of desolation is going to be, as it's referenced in starting in chapter 24 and verse 15. He talks about these references to the prophet Daniel, and the prophet Daniel in multiple places refers to this idea of the abomination of desolation and what that means as far as final judgment. But again, the point is, I really think the focus of this whole passage is, I've heard the story of the Bible summarized as Jesus is coming, Jesus is here, Jesus is coming again. And really the focus, not to oversimplify it, but to just put it simply, Jesus is talking about his return, right? He is talking about his, when he's coming back. He's talking about what that judgment is going to look like. And again, he uses this idea of a master going into a faraway land. He uses that in multiple parables. He uses that in the parables at the beginning of chapter 25, talking about the 10 virgins waiting for the bridegroom, the parable of the talents, very famous parable where we're waiting for the master to come back, and he's going to collect on what he has left us with. And I think that's, especially in this context, what is so helpful. We've talked about how practical the parables are and how simplistic the parables are. I think that's why it's so helpful to part of the reason why it's so helpful to have two parables to kind of put in simple terms what he's talking about, what Jesus is talking about here, so that we can kind of practically understand, okay, what does all this mean with these birth pains and this coming day and all of this? But we're waiting for our master to return, and he is going to, and we are going to give an account for how we have served him. And there's not going to be any hiding. There's not going to be any changing our mind or apologizing for being a bad servant, a slothful, worthless servant, as he says in the parable. So, Dan.
Are you saying, I want to make sure I understood correctly, are you saying you don't think any of this refers to the destruction of Jerusalem at all? That there's nothing in here that refers to the destruction of Jerusalem?
No, I would say there are parts of it that, so I don't want to, I guess, throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think the focus is the overall in these two chapters. Again, if we could go through every detail that he mentions in these two chapters, and some of it seems to kind of line up pretty well with the destruction of Jerusalem and this judgment what's coming in their time for the destruction of Jerusalem. But I do think the overall focus, and what he kind of seems to spend more time on is his final return. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just think we have to be very careful because, verse 34 of chapter 24 clearly says, "Surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until these things take place." So there's clearly something of which he's referring to that absolutely has reference to something that they would experience. When that kind of language is used everywhere in the Bible, that's not figurative for, hey, this is going to happen thousands of years from now or at the end of time. This is something that's going to happen. I'm telling you right now, we use that very same statement that Jesus makes regarding the kingdom. When he talks about the kingdom, there's some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God come with power. And we use that to undermine the concept of premillennialism that says, well, the kingdom was going to come some thousands of years later and he would eventually establish the kingdom. Now, I believe it's clear that there are times, Joel is an absolute perfect example, where a prophecy is the prophecy to David regarding his son, where prophecies can have a dual meaning, something in the immediate time as well as something referencing something yet to come. The other thing that I think we have to be cautious with when we talk about any kind of judgment language. If you take some of the imagery that's in this, and you go back to judgments of the nations in the Old Testament, the language is almost exact. It's very, very similar to the language. But it was clear that the idea of the sun going dark and stars falling from heaven and all these things were not referencing the end of time and the destruction of the world. Now, let me make clear, I'm not an AD 70. I don't believe everything wrapped up and God finished his work and he was done in AD 70. I don't believe it. I believe God does speak of the coming judgment at the end of time, the resurrection at the end of time. But I do think we have to be cautious with just saying, well, it just doesn't talk about the destruction of Jerusalem at all. I mean, that's what started the discussion. And so I think we have to be cautious in the way we present it.
You're right, and I would say again, I think the broader point that he, kind of where it's almost maybe a better way of saying it would be where he ends up is, and some of what he's talking about, especially with the parables, and I think part of, especially in chapter 25, talking about that final judgment. But I do think you're right, and I'm glad you brought up some of the Old Testament prophecies of. That dual fulfillment of prophecy and just kind of what God's judgment looks like in general. Again, not to just kind of overgeneralize, but again, just because of time and everything. I do think there's something to be said for just what does it look like when God judges anything. You know what I mean? Like as far as the different judgments in the Old Testament, obviously we know many world powers have come and gone, come and go in the Old Testament, have come and gone since. And so, but again, kind of ultimately arriving at, regardless of the political situation or, any of that, each one of us is going to have to give an account for how we've lived. Cody?
I think this chapter is interesting because Jesus is really doing something that is not uncommon for him to do, where we're familiar with parables, where Jesus takes something earthly and uses that to teach a spiritual message. Now he's doing that in a much larger sense, right, with something very earthly that these people would be familiar with, right? When Jesus came this time that we read about in the Gospels, the Jews were not ready for that. Obviously, we can read about the Jews' rejection of Jesus, and ultimately that's going to result in everything we know about the destruction of Jerusalem and God moving from just the Jews to now accepting all people as his chosen people. Right? That's a very real-world situation these people can relate to. But he's using that to draw on the greater point that you were talking about, that there is going to come a time where Jesus will return that is one everyone needs to be prepared for, right? He's drawing the parallels between the Jews' rejection and for all the rest of you, don't reject Jesus when he comes back the second time, because now all of the things he's talking about, to your point, his greater focus is that next coming, the final judgment, because that's the one everyone will need to be prepared for. The Jews have missed their opportunity, right? That ship has sailed. Now, here is what everyone must look forward to. Be cautious of and be mindful of which side of the group that you're on, right? Are you on the faithful or the not faithful side?
Exactly. I think that's a great point. And maybe a passage to kind of help summarize some of these things is if we look at, usually I try to stay in the book of Matthew just because that's kind of the point. But I want to go to Acts chapter 2 for just a moment, because I think that's kind of Acts chapter 2 is a really beautiful example of what Cody was just talking about and what we've been talking about, where as far as Pentecost goes, we're mainly talking to a Jewish audience, right? We're talking generally to a Jewish audience. They're there for Pentecost. And Peter, in his sermon, talks about, Peter is talking about Jesus, of course, and he talks about the fact that, especially speaking to a Jewish audience, essentially saying, you've been waiting for the Messiah all this time, and then you missed him. You missed it. You killed him, and now you've been judged for it. And so, in verse 36, just kind of reading his conclusion here, let all the house of Israel therefore know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. Okay, so. Again, this Jewish audience, like Cody said, they missed Jesus the first time. They weren't ready for him to come the first time. Obviously, a lot of people followed him, but obviously a lot of people didn't. He was very, he was hated, he was killed. And so, but the beauty of the gospel is even, in more contemporary to when Jesus left, when Jesus ascended, even if you missed him, even if you were one of the people literally, physically standing in the crowd screaming for him to be crucified, even if that was you, you can repent and be baptized and wash away your sins, right? And you can, even if you missed him, even if you, ruined it the first time, so to speak, you can still repent and be baptized and follow him. So I think that is just kind of a very practical application of what we're talking about with this kind of dual fulfillment, regardless of, and again, no matter what all happened, or in there, it's kind of weird when you're talking about timelines and going back in time and everything, but even for them, awaiting the destruction of Jerusalem and not knowing exactly how all that was going to play out, or maybe, not knowing that it was going to happen at all, you can still go to heaven, of course. You can still be baptized into Christ and be saved, even if, honestly, regardless of the, geopolitical situation. So, he talks about, makes very clear, my words will not pass away. Again, when you're talking about judgment and you're talking about all these things, many different things coming to an end, time coming to an end, the comfort that he gives is that these words will not pass away. And then I have in all caps to make it very clear, because you'll hear different people guessing or proposing or thinking they know, or all these different calculations. I heard a statistic from Tim, actually, that I think, 150 in the 20th century? So in the 20th century alone, there were 150 days, apparently, throughout the 20th century that were estimates from different groups or different people of that the world was going to end. We're still here. We're alive. Time has not ended. So, and even before that, there were more. And so, no one knows. When Jesus says that no one knows the day or the hour, no one knows when this is going to happen, only the Father knows. We need to take that seriously, and again, take the applications of the parables of the parable of the virgins, and then the parable of the talents seriously. And really, again, what it comes down to when we're talking about final judgment, when we're talking about what judgment is going to look like for us, the options are, we are either good and faithful servants, or we are wicked, slothful, and worthless servants. And again, not to oversimplify it, not to gloss over some really important discussion, but really that's what it comes down to. And so I think the most directly applicable point for each of us is, which is it? When the master comes back and looks at me and looks at my life and the things I say and how I spend my time and who I am and how I spend my life, will the verdict be good and faithful or wicked, slothful, and worthless? And that ultimately results in eternal punishment and versus eternal life, right? Those are the options. That's what it is. That's quite a bit to move on from. But any final comments about any of this conversation, Tim?
We said this before, but Jesus wraps it all up in verse 44, chapter 24. Therefore, you also be ready. So, for the portions of this chapter where Jesus is teaching about the pending coming of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, or his second coming, it's the same answer: be ready. We can remove all of our stress and our pain and worry if we're just ready.
That's exactly right. Just like anything in life, what's anytime you get in a car, if your airbags are working and you have your seatbelt on and you're driving safely, that's the best you can do. You know what I mean? Again, not to oversimplify it. I know we're talking about some really big themes here, but again, the best thing you can do is be ready, be prepared. And again, when he talks about his word, when he says, "My words will not pass away," he has told us exactly what is expected of him. It's not like it's a pop quiz on something the teacher hasn't told us about yet or didn't tell us was coming. He's told us that this is coming, and he's told us to be ready, and he's told us what readiness looks like, and so our job is to be ready. So I want to go ahead and move on to, again, obviously there's so much in these final few chapters. Looking at chapters 26 and 27, compare and contrast Jesus' trials before Caiaphas / the council, also known as the Sanhedrin, and then Pilate. What stands out about how the various people involved view or treat Jesus. So I want to go ahead and start with his Jewish trial in chapter 27, his trial before the Sanhedrin. What stands out to you about what happens before Caiaphas, or even the context of him being turned over to Caiaphas? If you had to say what the verdict is, or what the indictment is, what is he? Because I think this is really helpful for just kind of really thinking about part of how horrible his crucifixion is. What law did Jesus break? What did Jesus do wrong? I know he didn't do anything wrong, but in their eyes, what did he do wrong? JD. Okay, worked on the Sabbath. Yes, there's definitely multiple times throughout the Gospels where there's conflict over him working on the Sabbath. What else?
He didn't deny that he was the son of God, right? When he was posed that direct question, he said, I am. Right? It is as you say. To me, the biggest difference between these trials is the Jewish leaders were looking to accuse him, and they brought in many false witnesses, right? And then those last two false witnesses basically are the ones that sort of indicted him, which posed him to have to answer that question. That's a big difference when you get over on the Roman trial, because it looks much more fair. And the conclusion of Pilate is that he's essentially not guilty.
Right. That's what's, the Jewish people are all over him, right? They very obviously want him to die. They're furious about what he's saying. Obviously talking about, being okay with, breaking Mosaic law. They had tried to kill him in the sense of threatening and, being at the point of killing him. This had happened before. This had been in the works for a long time. But they are looking so hard. They're trying really, really hard to indict him any chance they get. And then they ultimately, it really comes down to blasphemy, right? That's what's so fascinating about it is, claiming, and we can in a sense, understand of if someone claims to be God and they're not, that is a huge deal. If someone were to do that today, and the Bible talks about, and even some of the end time language that we talked about in 24 and 25 talks about there will be false prophets and false Christs, and I'm sure we could all talk about different people throughout history or in the news where they claim to be somebody and they're very clearly not. So we understand why blasphemy is such a big deal. But what's so interesting about, and really the whole point of Jesus being indicted on blasphemy charges, if we want to put it that way, is he was God. He's the only person throughout history who can say, I'm God, or I am, and use this language and not have to recant, not have to back down. And in fact, it would be dishonest for him to back down. It would be dishonest for him to claim not to be who he was. And so really, he's just being honest. Did you have a comment over here, anyone? I thought I saw a hand. No? Okay. So he's turned over by Judas. We'll see some of these parallels in the Roman trial, but he's obviously turned over by Judas. It's before the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is 70 people. So that's also really interesting. I saw one note that said this might have been before the Sanhedrin, but also because it's in the middle of the night, it might have been just whoever could assemble. So that's also interesting to think about when, these different members of the Sanhedrin, were they just, woken up from different places? And, we have to, just kind of putting yourself there and thinking about these different members of the Sanhedrin being woken up in the middle of the night and realizing that they're finally gonna, I hate to even say it this way, but they finally got him, and they're finally gonna, it's happening. And so before those 70 people approximately, there's many false witnesses. It's just incredible that they're indicting him for essentially lying, saying he's God when he's not, even though he is. But then they have false witnesses. They have people who are lying to indict him, to have him killed. And so his indictment is blasphemy, like we've mentioned. And then his defense, in a way, is my father. He talks pretty extensively about who his father is. If we look at he remains silent in verse 62 of chapter 26, Matthew 26 and verse 62, the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, "You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" And then they answered, "He deserves death." And then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" And so in a way, he doesn't really give a defense, but he also... But again, there's nothing to defend, right? If you're being falsely accused of something, the best defense is, I didn't do anything wrong. And so he really just kind of takes that moment to just prophesy about himself. I think he does know that it's over, and he's not getting out of it, and the whole point is for him to not get out of it. And then they're mocking to him, again, thinking of this in a Jewish context, is mocking him to prophesy. You think you're a prophet, then prophesy. Tell us which one of us slapped you. And just absolutely despicable behavior of, again, and just thinking about all the layers of this, of, he did have the right to claim to be God because he was God. And, if we think about it in that way, he could have told them which one of them slapped him, but he just kind of recuses himself in a sense, and he just kind of lets it happen. And then he's bound and given to Pilate, which takes us to the Roman trial just thinking about some of these kind of parallels, where in the Jewish trial he's turned over by Judas. Obviously in the Roman trial he's turned over by the Jews. I don't know why these are going out of order, but the indictment here is, in a sense, claiming kingship. I thought that was kind of an interesting detail or parallel between the Jewish trial and the Roman trial. For a Jew, the worst thing you could do, one of the worst things you could do is claim to be God. But really, kind of like Tim was saying, it's almost like the Romans don't care. If you claim to be somebody to the Jews, we kind of don't care. Like, if you break one of their laws, okay, that's their problem. But if you're going to, claim to be king or claim to be, some sort of political figure, then that's where our issue lies. And so they also has some Jewish witnesses, so there's different people kind of, the Jewish people have fully turned on him at this point, where, those same, I wonder if they were I would imagine they were, some of them at least were the same witnesses, where you have these different false witnesses going against him. Obviously it's before Pilate, so just essentially before this one man instead of before this group of 70. And then he really gives no defense. Again, if you are a king and someone's accusing you of falsely claiming to be a king, what's he going to say, right? I'm not a king. He is a king. And so he's just in this really interesting position where he just doesn't defend himself at all. And again, going back to what Tim was saying a moment ago, just such a powerful statement. Why? What evil has he done? Just what an incredible statement from someone who was a Gentile, who didn't really care about the coming Messiah, didn't really know about the coming Messiah, and the fact that the Romans get it, in a sense, more than the Jews do, right? The Jews are ready to kill him, and the Romans just kind of think, what's the big deal? Why is this such an issue? Why should we kill him? He hasn't done anything wrong. But then, again, that's kind of interesting where the Jewish people are mocking him as a prophet, telling him to prophesy. And then when he's turned over to the Romans, because the indictment is that he's claiming to be king, they're mocking him as a king. They're putting the crown on him. They're putting the robe on him, and just kind of abusing him in a different way. And then he's abused, and he's ultimately turned over to the people, just really caving to peer pressure, political pressure, and then he's turned over to be killed. So, kind of fast forwarding, I know it may feel strange to kind of fast forward through the crucifixion. We'll certainly look at that more in Mark and Luke, but getting to the good news, ending on the good news in the last few minutes of our class. Just what are some of the reactions that, and this doesn't have to necessarily be from Matthew chapter 28, but what are some of the reactions? How do people react to Jesus being raised from the dead, or the claim that Jesus has been raised from the dead? JD?
Well, I'd say for the Pharisees, Sadducees, and perhaps the centurions they had guarding him, they were scared witless for a number of reasons, both for man's understanding and also for, I think, perhaps some of them were at least, quote-unquote, smart enough to realize he was telling the truth, and we just killed God's son, we're screwed.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot there as far as, just the fear that they would have experienced. I mean, you think about, it would be terrifying. I think that's something that you see even today with people looking at Jesus. And, I think when you look at the Bible, and if you're going to look at the Bible open-mindedly, and you're going to look at Jesus open-mindedly, it's really scary to think, what are the implications if I accept what I'm looking at, right? If the Bible is true, then what does that mean for me? And if Jesus was the Son of God, and in this context, just thinking about being a Roman soldier outside, and not just the career implications, or you're going to be executed if you let somebody go, or you let this body get stolen. But beyond that, what does that mean? I would love to kind of interview one of the Roman soldiers and think, the body wasn't stolen because you were there, or whatever you witnessed. who was that? Like, if he had the power to get up and walk out of a tomb, then who was he? Like, what does that mean? And so just thinking about those implications are really powerful. Obviously, there was great fear of the angel, maybe some fear, like we mentioned, of the implications of what that means. There's a lot of joy and eagerness. We know about Mary Magdalene and her response, and then as the news spreads. And I want to point out, too, in this immediate context, that I always like to bring up that the word gospel, when you talk about evangelism, you're talking about giving people good news. When you talk about spreading the gospel, you are spreading good news. And so really what it comes down to, and in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul kind of makes this point in long form of the foundation of everything we do is the good news is the tomb is empty. That's the point of everything. That's really what it goes back to. And this is it. This is it happening. And so if we look at, and even going to the Great Commission, in verse 16 of chapter 28, now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Just again, going back to that joy of, yes, he was killed, but now he's alive. Our Creator was here, and just how beautiful and powerful that is, which comes with a natural desire to spread good news. If you have good news, you can't wait to tell everybody. And that really is where our desire to evangelize comes from. But then on the flip side, you have this desire to lie and cover up. Again, if we're talking about my career is in trouble, my belief system is in trouble, I just don't like this, then there's that desire to kind of lie and cover that up. And then now there's that fear of what if I'm wrong? Like I was mentioning a minute ago, what does it mean if I'm incorrect about this? Hopefully now there's still joy and eagerness about the resurrection as well, a continued desire to spread good news. But then on the flip side, there's that hard-heartedness or just a rejection of the facts and evidence. And so this is really what it comes down to when we look at the resurrection and we think about who Jesus was and what he came to do and what he accomplished. What type of servant are we going to be? If he went through everything that he went through and he endured all of this, in his final days he talks about, I'm about to leave, but I'm coming back. And yes, it's been 2,000 years since that, but are we ready? What type of servant are we going to be? So in the last couple minutes, I want to go to, I accidentally skipped this last week, but I want to kind of catch up a little bit on our portrait of Jesus that we've been working on. And this will be really nice, I think, to continue into Mark and Luke as we kind of get more of a composite sketch, if you will, of what Jesus looks like. But just kind of looking at, these are some things that both from what we've talked about in previous classes, but I've kind of updated it, I guess, with some of the things that we've seen. But in addition to what is on here, what we have so far, especially when we talk about him talking about judgment and the resurrection and his trial, what stands out to you? What do we learn in these last few chapters about who Jesus was? Or what he's like, yes.
He's focused on doing the will of his Father. When he was in Gethsemane, the prayer that he prayed, "Thy will be done," his main focus was to become the perfect sacrificial lamb for mankind. And he did that. God's will was accomplished through his death on the cross.
Yes, ma'am, exactly. JD?
Now this might be some pretty low-hanging fruit, but I would like to say that Jesus was wise. The perks of being omniscient and being literally every moment of time potentially, yes, I could potentially save myself or even let my apostles fight on my behalf. But at the same time, consider what consequence would that have for those that I still intend to save? How would that jeopardize their salvation or further delay it than it should be? Weighing all the possible options and still seeing that the path was on the established plan by the Father was still the best possible plan in the grand scheme of saving creation.
You're exactly right. I think that's something that both of them pointed out that really is really a main point throughout the Gospels is he's sacrificial, right? He's always worried about literally everyone but himself. And my encouragement for this week would be, how do we exemplify that? How do we do that? How do we put others before ourselves in any way we can? So thank you so much. We'll be in Mark next week.